Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. On the morning of May 14, 2015, thick black smoke began pouring from the windows of a stately mansion in one of Washington, D.C.'s most exclusive neighborhoods. Flames licked at the curtains, then engulfed entire rooms. Firefighters rushed to the scene on Woodland Drive Northwest, in the affluent Woodley Park area, expecting a typical house fire. What they discovered instead would shake the nation's capital to its core and expose a crime so brutal, so meticulously planned, that it seemed almost incomprehensible. Inside that burning mansion lay 4 bodies. A family had been tortured and murdered in their own home. The victims were not just anyone, they were the Savopoulos family, pillars of the D.C. community, successful, beloved, and seemingly untouchable in their world of privilege and security. But on that terrible day, their fortress had been breached, their lives stolen, and their home turned into a crematorium designed to destroy evidence of unspeakable evil. This is the story of what happened inside that mansion during a nightmare that lasted nearly 20 hours. This is the story of how a family's ordinary Wednesday evening turned into their final moments on Earth. And this is the story of how investigators pieced together a puzzle of greed, betrayal, and violence that would lead them to a killer who had been hiding in plain sight. Let me take you back to the days before the fire, when the Savopoulos family was still alive, still planning for a future they would never see. Savas Savopoulos was 46 years old, a self-made millionaire who had built his success through hard work and determination. Born in Greece, he had immigrated to the United States as a young man with dreams that seemed almost impossibly ambitious. But Savas was the kind of person who made the impossible look easy. He was charismatic, intelligent, and driven by an almost relentless work ethic that impressed everyone who knew him. By 2015, Savas had become the president and CEO of American Iron Works, a successful construction company that specialized in building materials and steel fabrication. The company had contracts throughout the Washington, D.C. area, and Savas had earned a reputation as a fair employer and a shrewd businessman. He was known for remembering the names of his workers, for asking about their families, for treating everyone with respect regardless of their position in the company. People who worked for him didn't just respect him, they genuinely liked him. But Savas was more than just a businessman. He was a devoted family man who loved his wife and children with an intensity that was obvious to anyone who spent time with the family. He coached his son's sports teams, attended every school function, and made sure that despite his demanding work schedule, he was present in his children's lives. He had achieved the American dream and he was living it fully. His wife, Amy Savopoulos, was 47 years old in the heart of the family. Where Savas provided the ambition and drive, Amy provided warmth, creativity, and an infectious joy that made everyone around her feel welcome and valued. She was beautiful, with a radiant smile that lit up every room she entered. But her beauty was only a small part of who she was. Amy was deeply involved in her children's lives and in the community. She volunteered at local schools, organized charity events, and was known for her generosity to those less fortunate. Friends described her as the kind of person who would drop everything to help someone in need, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries, who made people feel seen and appreciated. She had a gift for making everyone feel like they mattered. The couple had 3 daughters and 1 son. Their son, Philip, was just 10 years old in May of 2015. A bright, energetic boy who loved sports, especially soccer and martial arts. Philip attended St. Albans School, one of the most prestigious private schools in Washington, D.C., where he was known as a kind, friendly child who got along well with his classmates and teachers. Philip had his father's determination and his mother's warmth. He was the kind of child who worked hard at everything he did, whether it was schoolwork or sports. He had dreams of playing professional soccer one day, and his parents encouraged those dreams while making sure he understood the value of education and hard work. Philip was close to his parents and adored his 3 older sisters, who doted on their little brother. The Savopoulos daughters Abigail, Katerina, and Lela were teenagers and young adults in 2015. They were away from home at various schools and programs when the events of May 2015 unfolded, a fact that would later feel like a cruel mercy. The girls were being raised with the same values their parents held dear: kindness, hard work, generosity, and gratitude for their privileged position in life. The family lived in a beautiful mansion at 321 Woodland Drive Northwest, in the Woodley Park neighborhood of Washington, D.C. The area is known for its tree-lined streets, its proximity to the National Zoo, and its population of diplomats, politicians, and successful business people. The Savvopoulos home was a stunning property valued at over $4 million, with multiple bedrooms, elegant living spaces, and all the amenities one would expect in such an exclusive neighborhood. But despite their wealth, the Savvopoulos family was known for being down to earth and approachable. They didn't flaunt their money or look down on others. They lived comfortably but not ostentatiously, and they raised their children to understand that their privilege came with responsibilities to help others and to contribute positively to the world. The family also employed household staff to help manage their busy lives and large home. Among these employees was Veralicia Figueroa, a housekeeper who had worked for the family for several years. Veralicia, known to everyone as Vera, was in her 50s and had become a trusted member of the household. She was hardworking, reliable, and devoted to the family she served. Vera had immigrated to the United States from El Salvador, seeking a better life for herself and her family. She had found that opportunity with the Savvopoulos family, who treated her with respect and kindness. She took pride in her work, keeping the mansion spotless and helping to create a warm, welcoming home environment. The family trusted her completely, and she had keys to the house and the alarm codes, a level of trust that was not given lightly. Vera lived in Northern Virginia with her husband and had a routine that was predictable and stable. She would arrive at the Savvopoulos home several times a week to clean, do laundry, and help with various household tasks. The family relied on her, and she took her responsibilities seriously. She had become particularly fond of young Philip, who would often chat with her while she worked, practicing his Spanish and telling her about his school day. The family also employed other staff members from time to time, including drivers and assistants for Savvis's business. One of these employees was a man named Darren Dallin Wint, though his connection to the family was more tangential than Vera's. Wint had worked for American Iron Works in the past, employed in a low-level position that involved manual labor and basic tasks. He had not worked directly in the Savvopoulos home, but he knew of the family and their wealth. Darren Wint was 34 years old in 2015, and his life stood in stark contrast to the success and stability of the Savvopoulos family. Where Savvis had built a business empire through hard work and integrity, Wint had drifted through life, leaving behind a trail of failed jobs, broken relationships, and increasingly violent behavior. Born in Guyana, Wint emigrated to the United States with his family when he was young, settling in the Washington, D.C. area. On the surface, he had opportunities available to him. He was physically strong, capable of work, and had access to employment. But Wint struggled to maintain steady employment, often clashing with supervisors and co-workers. Those who worked with him described him as having a volatile temper, an inability to accept criticism, and a tendency to make threats when things didn't go his way. Wint had worked at American Iron Works for only a brief 2013, about 2 years before the murders. He had been fired after just a few weeks on the job, reportedly for threatening other employees and for poor performance. The incident had been relatively minor at the time. Just another employee who hadn't worked out, but Wint had apparently harbored resentment about his termination. He had complained to family members that he hadn't been treated fairly, that he deserved more respect and more money. After leaving American Iron Works, Wint's life had continued on a downward trajectory. He moved frequently, staying with various family members in the D.C. area and in Maryland. He had a criminal record that included charges for assault, burglary, and other offenses. He had a history of domestic violence, with multiple women reporting that he had threatened or attacked them. He was known to carry weapons, including knives, and had a fascination with martial arts that bordered on obsession. Those who knew Wint described him as someone who always seemed angry, always seemed to feel that the world owed him something. He would talk about needing money, about wanting to live a better life, but he seemed unwilling or unable to put in the sustained effort required to achieve legitimate success. Instead, he drifted from one scheme to another, one job to another, one residence to another, never quite finding his footing but always blaming others for his failures. In the spring of 2015, Wint was essentially homeless, staying with his girlfriend in Maryland, but frequently bouncing between different locations. He had no steady income, no stable employment, and mounting frustrations about his financial situation. He knew that his former employer, Savas Savopoulos, was a wealthy man. He knew about the mansion in Woodley Park. And somewhere in his troubled mind, an idea began to form. An idea that would lead to one of the most brutal home invasion murders in Washington, D.C. history. But in early May of 2015, the Savopoulos family knew nothing of Darren Wint's growing desperation or his dark intentions. They were focused on their own busy, productive lives. Savas was managing several construction projects and preparing for business meetings. Amy was coordinating the family's schedule, planning for Philip's upcoming school activities, and making arrangements for the family's summer plans. Philip was excited about an upcoming martial arts tournament and couldn't stop talking about it. Their life seemed perfect. They had wealth, health, a loving family, and a bright future ahead of them. They lived in one of the safest neighborhoods in one of the most powerful cities in the world. They had security systems, staff, and all the protections that money could buy. But none of that would matter when evil came knocking at their door. The first hints that something was wrong began on Wednesday, May 13, 2015, a day that started like any other for the Savopoulos family. Savas went to work as usual that morning, heading to the offices of American Iron Works to oversee his business operations. He had meetings scheduled and projects to review. It was a typical busy day for a man who ran a successful company. Amy spent the morning at home, managing household affairs and preparing for Philip's activities. Philip was at school, where he was doing well academically and socially. Vera Figueroa was scheduled to work at the house that day. She arrived in the morning and began her usual cleaning routine, moving through the large mansion with the efficiency of someone who knew every corner of the home. Everything seemed normal. The house was peaceful, the family was going about their regular routines, and there was no indication that anything was amiss. But sometime during that Wednesday, something changed. The exact timeline would later become a crucial part of the investigation, as detectives tried to piece together when the nightmare began and how long it lasted. What investigators would later determine is that at some point on Wednesday, May 13th, most likely in the afternoon or early evening, Darren Wint entered the Savopoulos mansion. How he gained entry, whether through deception or force, would become a key question in the case. But once inside, he took control of the home and the family with shocking speed and ruthlessness. Wint was not alone. Though the exact number and identity of his accomplices would remain murky throughout the investigation, evidence would later suggest that at least one other person, possibly more, assisted him in the home invasion. These accomplices helped him control multiple victims and carry out a plan that seemed to have been conceived with at least some level of advanced planning. The first priority for any home invader is gaining control of the occupants, and Wint did this through violence and the threat of violence. He was armed. At some point during the ordeal, he would use a knife, a baseball bat, and apparently other weapons to terrorize and injure his victims. He made it clear from the beginning that he was willing to kill anyone who didn't cooperate. Imagine the terror that must have gripped the Savopoulos family in those first moments when they realized what was happening. One moment, they were in their safe, comfortable home, going about their normal routines. The next moment, they were prisoners, held captive by armed intruders who had invaded their sanctuary. Savas, a strong, capable man who had built his success through determination and hard work, must have immediately thought about how to protect his wife and son. Amy, a mother whose entire life revolved around caring for her family, must have been desperately afraid for Philip. And Philip himself, just 10 years old, must have been terrified beyond comprehension as he watched armed strangers threaten his parents. Wint's plan was built around money, specifically around extracting a large sum of cash from Savas Savopoulos. Wint knew that Savas was wealthy and that as the owner of a construction company, he likely had access to significant amounts of cash for payroll and other business expenses. What Wint wanted was simple. He wanted Savas to arrange for a large cash payment to be delivered to the house. But Wint's plan had a fundamental problem. Arranging for a large cash delivery would take time. Banks have limits on how much cash can be withdrawn without advance notice. Business accounts have procedures that must be followed. And most importantly, arranging for such a delivery would require Savas to communicate with his employees and possibly his bank, creating opportunities for him to alert authorities or to send coded messages asking for help. Wint's solution to this problem was brutal. He would hold the family hostage for as long as it took to get the money. And to ensure their cooperation, he would use violence, torture, and the constant threat of death. The ordeal that followed would last approximately 18 to 20 hours, from sometime on Wednesday afternoon or evening until the morning of Thursday, May 14th. During that time, the Savopoulos family and Vera Figueroa would endure unimaginable terror and suffering. Wint and his accomplices moved through the house, securing their captives and making sure they couldn't escape or call for help. They bound the victims. Evidence would later show that tape and other restraints were used. They controlled movement within the house, likely keeping the family in certain rooms, while they searched for valuables and planned their next moves. Communication with the outside world became Wint's tool for getting what he wanted. He forced Savas to send text messages and make phone calls to his employees, arranging for cash to be delivered to the house. But Savas had to be careful about what he said and how he said it. Wint was watching and listening, ready to hurt Savas's family if he detected any attempt to signal for help. On Wednesday evening, Savas sent a series of text messages to his assistant and other employees at American Iron Works. The messages were unusual in their tone and content, asking for a large sum of cash, of $40,000, to be delivered to his home the following morning. He claimed that the money was needed for a real estate deal or some other business purpose that required immediate cash. The employees who received these messages found them odd. It was unusual for Savas to request such a large cash delivery to his home. It was unusual for him to communicate about business matters so late in the evening. And there was something about the wording of the messages that seemed slightly off, not quite matching Savas's normal communication style. But the employees didn't have enough information to realize what was really happening. They couldn't know that their boss was sending these messages under duress, with a gun or knife held to his head, or with the lives of his wife and son hanging in the balance. They assumed that Savas had his reasons for the unusual request, and they began making arrangements to fulfill it. One employee later told investigators that he had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. The messages seemed to come from Savas's phone. They were signed with his name, and while the requests were unusual, they weren't impossible. Savas was the CEO, and if he needed cash for a business matter, it was the employee's job to make it happen. What the employees didn't know was that while they were reading these messages and preparing to deliver the cash, Savas and his family were living through a nightmare inside the mansion on Woodland Drive. The violence began almost immediately. Wint was not content to simply hold the family at gunpoint and wait for the money to arrive. He wanted to terrorize them, to assert his dominance, to make them understand that their lives depended entirely on his whims. Evidence would later reveal that Savas was beaten severely during the captivity. He suffered blunt force trauma to his head and body, injuries consistent with being struck repeatedly with a baseball bat or similar object. His injuries were so severe that even if he had survived the ordeal, he would have required significant medical treatment. Why did Wint beat Savas so brutally? The motivations are hard to fully understand, but they seem to have been a combination of sadism, control, and possibly revenge for perceived slights from Savas's company. Wint may have still harbored resentment about being fired from American Iron Works 2 years earlier. He may have enjoyed inflicting pain on a man he saw as representing everything he himself had failed to achieve. Or he may have simply been asserting dominance, showing the family that he held absolute power over them. Amy and Philip were forced to witness at least some of this violence. Imagine being Amy Savalos, watching the man you love being beaten while you are powerless to help him, while you are also trying to protect your terrified young son. Imagine being Philip, watching his father, his hero, his protector, being hurt while strange, angry men hold the family captive. The psychological torture was perhaps as severe as the physical violence. The family didn't know what Wint wanted, how long the ordeal would last, or whether they would survive. Every hour that passed must have felt like an eternity. Every sound of footsteps in the hallway could have been the moment when Wint decided he was done waiting and started killing. Vera Figueroa was also caught in this nightmare, though the exact circumstances of how and when she was taken captive remain somewhat unclear. What is known is that Vera was at the house at some point during the ordeal, and like the Savopoulos family, she became a prisoner. Vera was in her 50s, a hard-working woman who had done nothing to deserve the terror she was experiencing. She may have arrived at the house for a scheduled cleaning shift, not knowing that the home had been taken over by armed intruders. Or she may have been there from earlier in the day, before the invasion began. Either way, once Wint knew she was there, she became another hostage, another witness who could potentially identify him. For Wint and his accomplices, Vera presented a problem. They already had 3 hostages to control: Savas, Amy, and Philip. Adding a 4th made the situation more complicated. But letting her go was not an option because she had seen too much. So Vera joined the family in their captivity, bound and held against her will in a house she had once moved through freely. As Wednesday night turned into Thursday morning, the situation inside the mansion grew more desperate. The family had now been held captive for many hours. They had been beaten, threatened, and terrorized. They had no food, limited water, and no rest. They were exhausted, terrified, and in Savas's case, seriously injured. Wint was waiting for the money to arrive. He had forced Savas to arrange for the $40,000 cash delivery for Thursday morning, and now he needed to wait for that delivery to happen. But waiting created its own problems. The longer the situation went on, the greater the chance that someone would notice something was wrong. The longer Wint stayed in the house, the more evidence he left behind, and the longer the family remained alive, the greater the risk that they would somehow escape or signal for help. Wint may have already been planning what would happen after he got the money. He may have already decided that he couldn't leave witnesses who could identify him and testify against him. Or he may have been making those decisions in real time, reacting to the situation as it evolved. What is certain is that by Thursday morning, Wint had crossed too many lines to simply take the money and leave. He had beaten Savas severely. He had held the family for nearly a full day. They had seen his face. They knew who he was. And in Wint's criminal mind, that meant they had to die. Thursday, May 14, 2015, began like any other spring morning in Washington, D.C. People woke up, prepared for work, and started their daily routines. In the Woodley Park neighborhood, residents went about their business, unaware that just a few houses away, a family was fighting for their lives. At American Iron Works, Savas's employees were preparing to deliver the $40,000 in cash that he had requested. They had withdrawn the money from the company's bank account and placed it in a package as instructed. They believed they were carrying out a legitimate business transaction for their boss. The employee tasked with delivering the money drove to the mansion on Woodland Drive that Thursday morning. The exact time of the delivery has been established through investigation, but what happened during that brief transaction would become a crucial piece of the puzzle. The employee arrived at the house and someone, most likely Wint or an accomplice, met him at the door to receive the money. The exchange was quick, just a matter of minutes. The employee handed over the package containing $40,000 in cash, received some brief acknowledgement, and then left. Years later, that employee would struggle with guilt, wondering if he should have noticed that something was wrong, if he should have insisted on seeing Savas personally, if there was anything he could have done to save the family. But in the moment, he had no way of knowing what was really happening inside that house. He had delivered the money as instructed, and he left, believing he had simply completed an unusual errand for his boss. Inside the mansion, Wint now had what he had come 40,000 in cash. It was more money than he had ever possessed at one time. More money than he could earn in a year of legitimate work. His home invasion and kidnapping plan had worked. He had the money. But he also had 4 witnesses who could identify him, who could testify about what he had done, who could send him to prison for the rest of his life. What happened next would transform a kidnapping and robbery case into one of the most shocking murders in Washington, D.C. history. With the cash in his possession, Darren Wint faced a critical decision. He could take the money and flee, leaving the traumatized family alive to call police and identify him. Or he could eliminate the witnesses and try to destroy the evidence of what he had done. Wint chose murder. The exact sequence of events during the final hours inside the mansion remains partially reconstructed through forensic evidence, autopsy results, and the physical state of the crime scene. What emerged from the investigation was a picture of methodical, brutal violence that showed no mercy for age, gender, or the pleas of his victims. Sava Savopoulos, who had already endured hours of beatings and torture, was killed first, or at least, he was among the first to die. The autopsy would later reveal that he suffered catastrophic blunt force trauma to his head and body. He had been beaten with such force that his skull was fractured in multiple places. The injuries were consistent with being struck repeatedly with a baseball bat or similar heavy object. But the beating wasn't what killed him. Sava Savopoulos was stabbed to death. The knife wounds were precise and vicious, penetrating deep into his torso. These weren't defensive wounds or accidental cuts, they were deliberate. Fatal strikes designed to end his life quickly and permanently. Sava is the successful businessman who had built a company through hard work, who had employed Wint years earlier and likely never thought about him again, died in his own home, surrounded by the life he had built, unable to protect his family in their final moments. Imagine his last thoughts. As the knife entered his body, as he felt his strength leaving him, Savas must have known what was coming for his wife and son. He must have hoped, prayed, begged for their lives even as his own was ending. He must have felt the unbearable anguish of knowing that he couldn't save them, that all his success and strength and determination meant nothing in the face of this senseless violence. Amy Savopoulos watched her husband die. The evidence suggests she was still alive when Savas was killed, still conscious, still aware of what was happening. For a woman who had devoted her life to her family, who had built a home filled with love and warmth, the horror of watching her husband murdered must have been beyond comprehension. But Amy's ordeal was far from over. After killing Savas, Wint turned his attention to her. Amy was also stabbed to death, suffering multiple knife wounds that ended her life. The autopsy revealed that she fought back. There were defensive wounds on her hands and arms, evidence that she had tried to ward off the knife, tried to protect herself, and though she must have known it was hopeless. Amy Savopoulos, who had spent her life making others feel safe and loved, died fighting for her life in her own bedroom. The violence inflicted on Amy suggests rage beyond the practical need to eliminate a witness. Wint or his accomplices stabbed her multiple times, far more than would have been necessary to cause death. It was as if the killing itself wasn't enough. There was an element of fury, of making her suffer, of punishing her for the crime of having the comfortable life that Wint himself had never achieved. And then there was Philip, 10-year-old Philip Savopoulos, a child who loved soccer and martial arts, who had dreams of a future that now would never come, who had done absolutely nothing to deserve what happened to him. The murder of a child is perhaps the most incomprehensible act of evil a human being can commit. Philip wasn't a threat to Wint. He couldn't have overpowered his captors or escaped to call for help. He was a little boy who had watched his parents being tortured and killed, who must have been crying, begging, pleading for his life. None of that mattered to Darren Wint. Philip was also stabbed to death. His small body bore the same vicious knife wounds that had killed his parents. But Philip's murder carried an additional element of cruelty that would emerge during the investigation and would haunt everyone who worked on the case. Evidence suggested that Philip may have been the last family member killed. This means he may have watched both his parents die before Wint turned the knife on him. A 10-year-old child, alone with murderers, knowing what was about to happen, with no one left to protect him or comfort him. The psychological torture of those final moments, waiting for death while surrounded by the bodies of his murdered parents, is almost too terrible to contemplate. What were Philip's last thoughts? Did he call for his mother? Did he pray? Did he close his eyes and try to imagine he was somewhere else, somewhere safe? We will never know. What we do know is that Philip Savvopoulos died in that mansion, his childhood cut short by a man who valued $40,000 more than the life of an innocent child. Vera Figueroa, the housekeeper who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, was also murdered. The details of her death were similar to the family's. She had been stabbed. Her life ended because she had witnessed the crime and could identify the killers. Vera had come to America seeking a better life. She had worked hard, supported her family, and built a quiet, stable existence. She had been trusted by the Savvopoulos family, welcomed into their home, treated with respect and kindness. And now she lay dead alongside them, another victim of Wint's greed and brutality. 4 people were dead. A family had been annihilated. A hard-working woman had been murdered. And Darren Wint, standing in that mansion surrounded by the carnage he had created, now faced another problem: how to cover up what he had done. The house was filled with evidence. There was blood everywhere, on the floors, on the walls, on the furniture. There were the bodies themselves, which would eventually be discovered and would tell investigators a detailed story of how the victims had died. There was DNA, Wint's own genetic material, left behind through sweat, saliva, blood, or other biological matter. There were fingerprints, footprints, trace evidence from clothing and hair. Any competent forensic investigation would link Wint to the crime scene. He had spent nearly 20 hours in the house. He had touched things, moved through rooms, left behind biological material that would identify him as surely as if he had signed his name. Fire destroys evidence. It consumes DNA, obliterates fingerprints, turns detailed crime scenes into ash and rubble. A hot enough fire, burning long enough, can make forensic investigation extremely difficult or even impossible. Bodies burned beyond recognition can't easily tell investigators how they died. Evidence turned to ash can't be collected and analyzed, so Wint decided to burn the mansion down, with the bodies inside. The accelerant he chose was gasoline. At some point either before or shortly after the murders, Wint or his accomplices had obtained gasoline, multiple gallons of it, enough to ensure that the fire would spread quickly and burn hot. Where they got the gasoline became an important investigative question, because purchasing or transporting large quantities of gas can leave a trail that police can follow. Wint moved through the mansion, splashing gasoline in multiple rooms. He poured it on the bodies, on the furniture, on the carpets and curtains. The smell must have been overpowering, the fumes heavy in the air. He was methodical about it, making sure that the fire would spread throughout the house, that multiple areas would ignite and create an inferno that would consume everything. Then, with the 4 bodies lying where they had fallen and gasoline coating surfaces throughout the mansion, Wint lit the fire. The flame started small, then grew rapidly as they found fuel in the gasoline-soaked materials. Fire raced along the trails of accelerant, jumping from room to room, climbing walls and consuming curtains. The temperature inside the house began to rise rapidly, reaching hundreds and then thousands of degrees as the fire intensified. Smoke began pouring from the windows, thick and black, carrying with it the toxic fumes of burning materials and the horrific reality of what was burning inside. The mansion, which had been a symbol of success and family happiness, was now a crematorium, its rooms filled with flames that were meant to hide the evidence of murder. Wint and his accomplices fled the house, carrying with them the $40,000 in cash and whatever other valuables they had stolen during the ordeal. They had murdered 4 people in cold blood, set fire to a mansion in one of Washington, D.C.'s most expensive neighborhoods. And now they were running, trying to get as far from the crime scene as possible before the fire was discovered and the bodies were found. But fire is difficult to control. Even when it's deliberately set, it was approximately 10:15 p.m. on Thursday, May 14, 2015, when neighbors in the Woodley Park area began to notice smoke. At first, it might have seemed like it was coming from a chimney or perhaps a small outdoor fire. But the smoke grew thicker, darker, more ominous. And then someone saw the flames. Emergency calls began flooding into 911. Residents reported a house fire on Woodland Drive, flames visible through the windows, smoke pouring into the sky. The calls were urgent, frantic. This was clearly a major fire, and it was spreading quickly. Fire trucks from multiple stations responded, sirens wailing as they raced through the streets of Woodley Park. Firefighters arrived at 321 Woodland Drive to find the mansion fully engulfed in flames. Smoke billowed from broken windows. Fire had consumed entire rooms, and the heat was so intense that they could feel it from the street. The firefighters went to work immediately, connecting hoses to hydrants and directing powerful streams of water at the burning structure. Their first priority was to keep the fire from spreading to neighboring homes. In a neighborhood where houses sit relatively close together, a fire in one mansion could easily jump to others if not controlled quickly. But even as they fought the flames, the firefighters were dealing with a troubling question: was anyone inside the house? In any residential fire, the primary concern is always life safety. Firefighters are trained to search burning buildings for victims, to risk their own lives to save others. But the intensity of the fire at the Savopoulos mansion made entry extremely dangerous. The structure was beginning to collapse in places, floors were giving way, and the heat was so extreme that it could kill a firefighter in seconds. Still, they had to try. Once they had knocked down some of the flames and made entry marginally safer, firefighters in full protective gear ventured into the burning mansion to search for possible victims. What they found would shock even these experienced first responders who had seen death many times before. In the upstairs bedrooms, amid the smoke and flames and destruction, they found bodies. The first responding firefighters couldn't immediately tell how many victims there were or how they had died. The bodies were severely burned, and the conditions inside the house made detailed examination impossible. All they could do was confirm that there were multiple fatalities, and that this was now a potential crime scene as well as a fire scene. The firefighters retreated, continuing to fight the fire from outside while waiting for it to be safe enough for investigators to enter. Protocol in situations like this is clear. Once bodies are discovered in a fire, the fire department continues its work while simultaneously notifying police and fire investigators, who will determine whether the deaths were accidental or criminal. It took several hours to fully extinguish the fire. The mansion was extensively damaged, with entire rooms destroyed, roofs collapsed, and structural elements compromised. Water from the fire hoses had combined with the destruction from the flames to create a sodden, blackened ruin of what had once been a beautiful home. As the last of the flames were extinguished and the smoke began to clear, investigators from the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department and the D.C. Fire and Emergency Medical Services Department began to arrive at the scene. They suited up in protective gear and prepared to the mansion to document the scene and examine the bodies. What they found inside would quickly elevate this from a tragic house fire to one of the most intensive murder investigations in Washington, D.C. history. The bodies of Sava Savopoulos, Amy Savopoulos, Philip Savopoulos, and Vera Figueroa were found in the upstairs area of the mansion. Despite the extensive fire damage, investigators could immediately tell that this was not a simple case of a family dying in an accidental house fire. The positioning of the bodies was wrong. In a typical fire death, victims are usually found trying to escape, near doors or windows, in hallways, or in places where they were overcome by smoke while attempting to flee. But the Savopoulos family and Vera were found in the bedrooms, and their positions suggested they had been incapacitated or restrained before the fire started. More telling were the injuries visible even on the burned bodies. The fire had consumed clothing and skin, but underneath, investigators could see evidence of trauma that had nothing to do with the fire. There were fractures, stab wounds, and other injuries that clearly predated the blaze. This had been murder, followed by arson to cover it up. The crime scene was immediately secured and expanded. The entire mansion and the surrounding property became an active investigation zone, with police tape cordoning off the area and preventing anyone from entering or leaving without authorization. Additional detectives, forensic specialists, and crime scene technicians were called in to begin the painstaking work of documenting everything. The medical examiner's office was notified, and their investigators arrived to take custody of the bodies. The victims would be transported to the morgue where detailed autopsies would be performed to determine exact causes of death, timing, and any other information that could be gleaned from the remains. As this was happening, investigators began the process of trying to figure out who the victims were and notifying their next of kin, one of the most difficult tasks in any murder investigation. The mansion was registered to Savas and Amy Sopolos, so identifying them was relatively straightforward once investigators accessed property records. But confirming that the bodies were actually the Savopoulos family required more work, especially given the fire damage that had destroyed many identifying features. Detectives began making calls, trying to locate family members and to piece together who had been in the house when the fire started. They learned that the Savopoulos couple had 4 children, but that 3 of their daughters were away at school or other activities. This meant that if the bodies in the mansion were the Savopoulos family, it would likely be Savas Amy and their 10-year-old son Philip. The 4th body presented a question mark initially. Who was this person, and why had they been in the house? It wouldn't take long for investigators to identify Vera Figueroa through her family members and employer records, but in those first hours, the presence of a 4th victim added another layer of complexity to an already horrifying crime. As the afternoon of May 14th turned into evening, the investigation was ramping up rapidly. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Department had deployed its major case unit, its best homicide detectives, and extensive forensic resources to the case. The FBI was notified and offered assistance. Murders this brutal, especially involving a wealthy family in a high-profile neighborhood, would attract federal attention. But even as dozens of investigators swarmed over the crime scene, examining every inch of the burned mansion, collecting evidence, and photographing the devastation, they were facing a crucial problem. They had no idea who had done this or why. The fire had destroyed much of the evidence. DNA samples that might have identified the killers were burned away. Fingerprints were obliterated. Blood spatter patterns that could have told investigators exactly how the murders happened were consumed by flames. The careful crime scene that might have existed before the fire was now a chaotic mess of ash, water damage, and structural collapse. But fire doesn't destroy everything, and in this case, Darren Wint had made critical mistakes that would eventually lead investigators directly to him. The first break in the case came from the bodies themselves. Despite the fire damage, the medical examiner was able to conduct thorough autopsies on all 4 victims. These examinations revealed several crucial facts that would guide the investigation. All 4 victims had died before the fire started. This was determined through several factors, including the absence of smoke in their lungs and the nature of their injuries. If they had been alive when the fire started, they would have inhaled smoke and shown other signs of trying to escape or protect themselves from the flames. Instead, the evidence showed they were already dead when the fire was set. The exact cause of death for each victim was determined to be a combination of blunt force trauma and stab wounds. Savas had suffered the most extensive beating, with multiple skull fractures and broken bones in addition to the fatal stab wounds. Amy and Vera had also been stabbed multiple times. Philip, the 10-year-old boy, had been stabbed to death. The brutality of the murders was shocking even to experienced homicide detectives. These weren't quick, clean killings designed simply to eliminate witnesses. There was rage here, excessive violence, a level of brutality that suggested either extreme anger or possibly sadistic pleasure in inflicting pain. The medical examiner also found evidence that the victims had been restrained at some point during their captivity. There were marks on their wrists and ankles consistent with duct tape or zip ties. This suggested a prolonged ordeal. The family hadn't been killed immediately upon the invasion of their home. Instead, they had been held captive, restrained, terrorized for hours before being murdered. Toxicology reports would later reveal another disturbing detail. There were no drugs or sedatives in the victims' systems. This meant they had been fully conscious during their captivity. They weren't drugged or unconscious. They were awake, aware, and experiencing every moment of the nightmare. While the medical examiner was working on the bodies, crime scene investigators were carefully searching through the ruins of the mansion, looking for anything that could help identify the killers or explain what had happened. Despite the extensive fire damage, they found important evidence: pieces of duct tape that had been used to restrain the victims, a baseball bat that appeared been used in the beatings, zip ties, and in one crucial find, investigators discovered a partially burned piece of pizza crust. The pizza crust seemed like an odd detail in such a horrific crime scene, but it would prove to be the single most important piece of evidence in the entire investigation. Someone had eaten pizza during the approximately 20-hour ordeal inside the mansion, and whoever had eaten that pizza had left their DNA on the crust. The pizza crust was carefully collected, packaged, and sent to the forensic laboratory for DNA analysis. If the person who had eaten that pizza was in any criminal database, investigators would be able to identify them. And if that person was one of the killers, they would have their first concrete lead. While waiting for the DNA results, detectives were pursuing other lines of investigation. They began interviewing anyone who had contact with the family in the days leading up to the murders. They spoke with neighbors, asking if anyone had seen suspicious vehicles or people in the area. They collected security camera footage from homes and businesses in the neighborhood, looking for any images that might show the killers arriving or leaving. They also began looking carefully at the Savvopoulos family's finances, business dealings, and personal relationships. In cases like this, investigators always consider several possible motives. Was this a random home invasion, a targeted hit related to business dealings, a personal vendetta, or something else entirely? Savvas Savvopoulos' business became a focus of the investigation early on. As the owner of American Iron Works, a construction company dealing with significant contracts and considerable money, Savvas might have had business rivals or disgruntled employees who could harbor grudges. Detectives began compiling a list of everyone who worked for or with American Iron Works, anyone who had been fired, anyone who had disputes with the company. They also investigated Savvas's personal life, looking for affairs, gambling debts, or other issues that might have made him a target. But by all accounts, Savvas was a devoted family man with no secret vices or dangerous habits. His marriage was strong, his business was legitimate, and there were no obvious enemies who would want him dead. The interviews with American Iron Works employees revealed something crucial, however. Multiple employees told detectives about the strange text messages they had received from Savvas on Wednesday evening, May 13th. The messages requesting $40,000 in cash to be delivered to the house had struck several people as odd at the time. One employee described how he had delivered the cash to the mansion on Thursday morning, just hours before the fire. He explained that someone had met him at the door, taken the money, and sent him on his way. He hadn't seen Savvas personally, and looking back, he realized that the brief transaction had been strange. Why wouldn't Savvas have come to the door himself? Why had the handoff been so rushed? This information was a major breakthrough. It suggested that the killers had held the family hostage specifically to extort money from Savvas's business. The timeline was becoming clearer. The family had been taken captive on Wednesday, held overnight while arrangements were made for the cash delivery. The money had been delivered Thursday morning, and then the family had been murdered and the house set on fire. This wasn't a random home invasion that had gone wrong. This was a planned kidnapping and extortion that had always been intended to end in murder. Detectives obtained copies of the text messages sent from Savvas's phone. They analyzed the wording, the timing, and the content. The messages had indeed come from Savvas's phone, but the phrasing and tone suggested he might have been under duress when sending them. There were small inconsistencies in punctuation and word choice that didn't quite match Savvas's normal style. The $40,000 had apparently been taken by the killers when they fled. It was part of their motive. They had wanted money, and they've been willing to torture and murder an entire family to get it. But 40,000, while a significant sum, hardly seemed worth 4 murders and the intense police investigation that would inevitably follow. Darren Wint had traded 4 lives for money that might last him a few months at most. He had committed one of the most brutal crimes in Washington, D.C. history for a paydate in the end. Wasn't even that large. As the investigation continued, detectives were also trying to understand the timeline of the fire itself. When exactly had it been set? How long had it burned before being discovered? And crucially, had anyone seen the killers leaving the mansion? The fire department's timeline showed that the first 911 calls had come in around 1:15 p.m. on Thursday, May 14th. The fire had been burning for some unknown amount of time before that, possibly just minutes, possibly longer. Based on the extent of the damage and the speed at which the fire had spread, arson investigators believed that the fire had been set using an accelerant, most likely gasoline. This meant the killers had planned the arson in advance. They had brought gasoline to the mansion, or had sent someone to purchase it, knowing they intended to burn the house down. The murders had been premeditated, and so had the cover-up. Detectives canvassed the neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen anyone manching around the time the fire started. They were looking for people carrying bags or packages, people in a hurry, vehicles speeding away. But in a busy neighborhood in the middle of the day, it was difficult to distinguish between normal activity and someone fleeing a crime scene. Security cameras from nearby homes and businesses were collected and reviewed. The process was tedious. Hours and hours of footage had to be watched, looking for anything suspicious. But modern investigations rely heavily on video evidence, and in a neighborhood like Woodley Park, there were multiple cameras that might have captured something useful. As detectives worked through the evidence and pursued leads, the DNA analysis of the pizza crust was being conducted at the forensic laboratory. DNA testing is a precise science. The sample had to be extracted, amplified, analyzed, and then compared against databases of known offenders. The process couldn't be rushed. But everyone working the case knew that this single piece of evidence might be the key to solving the murders. On May 20, 2015, 6 days after the fire, the DNA results came back, and they gave investigators exactly what they needed: a name, Darren Dylan Wint. The DNA on the pizza crust matched Darren Wint's profile in the criminal justice system database. He had a record, which meant his DA was on file, and the match was conclusive. Wint had been inside the Savopoulos mansion, and he had eaten pizza while holding the family hostage. Detectives immediately began pulling everything they could find on Darren Wint. His criminal history, his employment records, his known associates, his last known addresses, his family members. Every piece of information was potentially crucial in understanding who this man was and where he might be now. What they discovered was troubling. Wint had a history of violence, including assault charges and domestic abuse allegations. He had worked briefly for American Iron Works in 2013, meaning he had a direct connection to Sava Savopoulos and would have known about the family's wealth. He had been fired from that job, possibly creating a motive for revenge or resentment. The connection to American Iron Works was particularly significant. It meant this wasn't a random home invasion. Wint had specifically targeted the Savopoulos family because he knew Savas and knew about the business and knew there was money to be obtained. This was personal in a twisted way. But knowing who committed the murders and finding him were two very different challenges. Wint had a 6-day head start. He could be anywhere. He had $40,000 in cash, which would allow him to travel, hide out, or disappear if he was smart about it. And he had every reason to run. He knew that the DNA evidence would eventually lead police to him, and he knew that he was facing multiple murder charges and almost certainly the death penalty. The D.C. Metropolitan Police Department immediately issued an arrest warrant for Darren Dylan Wint on multiple counts of first-degree murder, felony murder, kidnapping, arson, extortion, and burglary. The charges were as serious as they could possibly be, and the warrant was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the region and nationally. But the police didn't immediately make Wint's identity public. This was a strategic decision. If Wint didn't know he had been identified, He might remain in the area or make mistakes that would help police locate him. But if his name and photo were released to the media, he might go deeper underground, making capture much more difficult. For several days, detectives worked quietly, tracking Wint's movements and trying to locate him without alerting him to the fact that they knew his identity. They spoke with his family members, his known associates, his former girlfriends. They staked out locations where he was known to frequent. They monitored social media accounts and electronic communications, looking for any sign of where he might be. What they learned painted a picture of a man on the run. In the days immediately after the murders, Wint had apparently stayed in the Washington, D.C. area, possibly at locations in Maryland. He had been in contact with various family members and associates, though it wasn't clear whether any of them knew what he had done. Wint had apparently spent some of the stolen money quickly. Witnesses later reported seeing him with large amounts of cash in the days after the murders, buying things, paying for meals and hotels in cash, acting like someone who had suddenly come into money. This reckless spending was both helpful and frustrating for investigators. Helpful because it created a trail of witnesses who had seen him. Frustrating because it meant the evidence of the crime was being dispersed and spent. On May 21, 2015, police made the decision to go public with Wint's identity. They released his name and photograph to the media, asking for the public's help in locating him. The story exploded across local and national news. The brutal murder of a wealthy family in their mansion was already a major story, but now there was a face to attach to the crime, a suspect who was armed, dangerous, and on the run. The media coverage was intense. Wint's photograph appeared on every local news broadcast, on the front pages of newspapers, on social media. The details of the crime, the torture, the murder of a 10-year-old boy, the burning of the house, shocked the public and created enormous pressure for police to capture the killer quickly. Tips began pouring into police from around the region. People reported seeing someone who looked like Wint at gas stations, hotels, restaurants, bus stations. Each tip had to be investigated, each sighting checked out. Most were false alarms, people who looked similar to Wint, or cases of mistaken identity. But each one had to be treated as potentially legitimate, because any one of them could lead that resulted in Wint's capture. Meanwhile, detectives were continuing to investigate the crime itself, trying to determine whether Wint had acted alone or had accomplices. The evidence suggested that at least one other person had been involved in the home invasion. Controlling 4 hostages for nearly 20 hours would have been difficult for a single person. Someone had helped Wint, someone who was also guilty of these murders. Investigators looked closely at Wint's family members and known associates. Who would have been willing to participate in such a brutal crime? Who had Wint been in contact with in the days before the murders? Who might have helped him obtain gasoline, transport the stolen money, or hide from police afterward? Several of Wint's relatives became subjects of intense scrutiny. Detectives interviewed them repeatedly, looking for inconsistencies in their stories, searching for evidence that they had known about the crime or helped Wint evade capture. Some of these family members would eventually face charges themselves for lying to investigators or for helping Wint, though the question of who actually participated in the murders remained complex. As the manhunt for Wint intensified, he was reportedly moving around the region, never staying in one place for long. He knew police were looking for him. He knew his face was all over the news, and he knew that anyone who recognized him might call the authorities. But Wint made critical mistakes. Instead of leaving the region entirely or finding a secure hiding place, he stayed relatively close to Washington, D.C., in the Maryland and Virginia areas. He continued to associate with people who knew him, making it more likely he would be spotted. And he kept spending the stolen money in ways that created a trail for police to follow. On the evening of May 21st, just hours after his identity was released to the public, investigators received information that Wint might be at a location in Maryland. A massive police presence converged on the area, but Wint managed to leave before they arrived. It was a frustrating near miss. They had been so close to capturing him. The pattern continued for several days. Police would receive a tip, respond quickly, and arrive to find that Wint had just left. It seemed like he had some warning system, either through associates who were monitoring police activity or through his own awareness of being hunted. He was staying one step ahead, but the net was closing. By May 22nd, law enforcement had established that Wint was likely traveling with several other people, possibly family members or close associates. Surveillance had identified a vehicle that Wint was believed to be using, a box truck that had been seen at several locations where Wint had been spotted. The involvement of multiple people in Wint's flight from justice complicated the manhunt. Were these people helping him voluntarily, or was Wint coercing them? Were they aware of what he had done? Or had he lied to them about why police were looking for him? These questions mattered both for the safety of those individuals and for the legal consequences they might face. Investigators put out alerts for the box truck, distributing the license plate number and description to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. Every police officer, sheriff's deputy, and state trooper in Maryland, Virginia, and D.C. was looking for that vehicle. The break came on the night of May 1st, continuing into the early morning hours of May 22nd. Police received information that Wint and several associates were staying at a hotel in College Park, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. The information was solid. Investigators had confirmed sightings and had identified the vehicles Wint was using. A massive police operation was organized. The U.S. Marshal Service, the D.C. Metropolitan Police, the FBI, and multiple Maryland law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts. They couldn't afford another near miss. This time, they would surround the location with overwhelming force and ensure that Wint had no chance to escape. As Wint and his companions prepared to leave the hotel, they were being watched. Surveillance teams had eyes on them, tracking their movements, coordinating with tactical units that were positioning themselves for an arrest. The plan was to stop the vehicles once they were on the road, using a coordinated vehicle stop that would prevent any possibility of escape or resistance. In the early evening of May 21st, Wint and several other people got into two vehicles, the box truck and a car, and left the hotel. They were heading toward D.C., possibly planning to flee the area or retrieve something they had left behind. But they never made it to their destination. On Route 1 in College Park, Maryland, police vehicles suddenly surrounded the two cars that Wint was traveling in. Multiple police cars boxed in the via any escape route. Officers in tactical gear, weapons drawn, surrounded the cars and ordered everyone inside to show their hands and exit the vehicles. The arrest was executed with precision. There would be no high-speed chase, no shootout, no opportunity for Wint to harm anyone else or to escape. Within minutes, Darren Dylon Wint was in handcuffs, surrounded by the officers who had been hunting him for over a week. Also arrested were 4 other people who had been in the vehicles with Wint. These individuals included some of Wint's relatives and associates. Police weren't immediately sure what role, if any, these people had played in the murders or in helping Wint evade capture. They would all be questioned extensively to determine a level of involvement. When police searched the vehicles, they found evidence that would strengthen the case against Wint. There was cash, thousands of dollars that appeared to be the 40,000 stolen from the Savopoulos family. There were weapons. There were cell phones that might contain communications proving Wint's involvement or identifying his accomplices. Darren Wint was transported to police headquarters, where he was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, felony murder, kidnapping, burglary, extortion, and arson. The evidence against him was overwhelming: his DNA at the crime scene, his connection to the victims through his former employment, the timeline that placed him at the mansion during the murders, and the stolen money found in his possession. Wint invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney. He would not confess to the murders, would not explain his actions, would not show any remorse for what he had done. From the moment of his arrest, Wint became uncooperative, refusing to answer questions about the crime or about whether anyone had helped him. The arrest brought some measure of relief to a shocked community, but it couldn't undo the horror of what had happened. 4 people were still dead, a family had been destroyed, and the long process of seeking justice through the criminal courts was just beginning. In the days following Wint's arrest, Investigators continued to piece together exactly what had happened during those terrible hours inside the mansion. They interviewed other people who had been arrested with Wint, trying to determine whether any of them had participated in the murders or had knowingly helped Wint evade capture. Some of those arrested were eventually released without charges, after investigators determined they had not been involved in the crime and had not known the full extent of what Wint had done. Others faced charges for lying to investigators or for obstruction of justice. The question of who, if anyone, had helped Wint the murders remained a focus of the investigation. Phone records from the days before and during the murders revealed a pattern of communications between Wint and various associates. Some of these calls were made in the hours when the Savopoulos family was being held hostage, raising questions about whether Wint had been coordinating with accomplices or asking for help with aspects of the crime. Financial records showed that in the days before the murders, Wint had been essentially broke, with no legitimate income and mounting debts. The sudden acquisition of $48,000 in cash would have been obvious to anyone close to him. Investigators wanted to know who had seen Wint with the money, and whether anyone had questioned where it came from. The investigation also revealed details about how Wint had obtained the gasoline used to set the fire. Surveillance footage from a gas station showed someone purchasing multiple containers of gasoline in the hours before the mansion was burned. The timing and location of this purchase fit perfectly with the timeline of the crime, providing yet another piece of evidence linking Wint to the arson. As the criminal case against Wint was being built, the Savopoulos family's 3 surviving daughters were dealing with unimaginable grief. In a single day, they had lost their parents and their younger brother. Their childhood home was destroyed. Their sense of safety and security was shattered. The daughters released a statement through their representatives, thanking law enforcement for their work in capturing their family's killer and asking for privacy as they grieved. They described their parents as loving and devoted, their brother as a bright light whose future had been stolen. They spoke of the hole left in their lives that could never be filled. Vera Figueroa's family was also mourning. Vera had been a hard-working woman who had done nothing wrong except show up for work on the wrong day. She had been caught in the nightmare through no fault of her own, killed simply because she was a witness to Wint's crimes. Her family struggled to understand why their loved one had to die, why she had been targeted along with the family she served. The community response to the murders was one of shock and sorrow. Vigils were held for the victims. The school that Philip attended held memorial services, with students and teachers remembering the friendly, energetic boy who would never return to their classrooms. Business associates of Savas held remembrances, speaking about his integrity, his work ethic, and his kindness. But alongside the grief was anger at the senseless brutality of the crime. Anger that a family could be tortured and murdered in their own home. Anger that a child's life could be snuffed out for money. The public wanted justice, wanted to understand how something so evil could happen, wanted assurance that the person responsible would pay the ultimate price for his crimes. As Wint sat in jail awaiting trial, prosecutors began the complex task of preparing their case. They had to organize thousands of pieces of evidence, coordinate hundreds of witness testimonies, and build a narrative that would prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Darren Wint had murdered the Savopoulos family and Vera Figueroa. The physical evidence was strong. The DNA on the pizza crust definitively placed Wint in the house during the time the family was held captive. His former employment at American Iron Works established his connection to the victims and provided a possible motive. The timeline of the cash delivery, combined with the text messages sent from Savas's phone, showed the extortion plot. The stolen money found in Wint's possession when he was arrested linked him directly to the crime. But prosecutors wanted more. They wanted to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Had Wint acted alone, or had others helped him? Who had assisted in planning the crime? Who had helped him evade capture? These questions needed to be answered not just for the sake of justice, but to ensure that everyone responsible for these murders was held accountable. The investigation into potential accomplices continued for months. Several of Wint's relatives were charged with various crimes to helping him after the murders or lying to investigators. But proving that anyone other than Wint had actually participated in the home invasion and murders proved challenging. The evidence suggested that at least one other person had been present during the captivity of the family. There were indications of multiple people moving through the house, and controlling 4 hostages for nearly 20 hours would have been extremely difficult for one person alone. But identifying who that person or persons were with certainty was another matter. Some family members claimed they had no knowledge of Wint's crimes until after his arrest. Others gave conflicting accounts of Wint's whereabouts and activities in the days surrounding the murders. Sorting through these claims, determining who was truthful and who was protecting Wint, became a major focus of the investigation. As the legal proceedings moved forward, details about Wint's life and psychology began to emerge. Mental health experts examined him to determine if he was competent to stand trial, and to understand what had driven him to commit such brutal murders. What emerged was a picture of a deeply troubled man who had never found his place in society. Wint had grown up with opportunities. His family had immigrated legally to the United States. He had access to education and employment. He had physical strength and capability. But he had squandered every opportunity, drifting from job to job, burning bridges, leaving behind failed relationships and accumulating criminal charges. Those who knew Wint described him as someone who was always angry, always feeling victimized, always believing that others were getting breaks he deserved. He had a grandiose sense of his own importance combined with a complete inability to achieve anything meaningful through legitimate means. When he saw successful people like Savas Savvopoulos, he didn't feel inspired. He felt resentful and entitled to what they had. This toxic combination of entitlement, resentment, and willingness to use violence had created a person capable of extraordinary cruelty. Wint didn't just want money. He wanted to punish the Savvopoulos family for having what he didn't have. The excessive violence used against the victims, the torture and prolonged captivity, suggested that this was about more than just robbery. It was about power, about making successful people suffer, about extracting revenge for perceived slights. The murder of 10-year-old Philip Savvopoulos was particularly difficult to explain or understand. A child posed no threat to Wint. Killing Philip served no practical purpose. It didn't help Wint escape or cover his tracks. But Wint had killed the boy anyway, showing a level of depravity that shocked even experienced homicide investigators and prosecutors. Mental health evaluations ultimately found Wint competent to stand trial. He understood the charges against him, understood the legal process, and was capable of assisting in his own defense. He might be deeply disturbed, might have personality disorders or antisocial traits, but he was not legally insane. He knew what he was doing when he murdered 4 people, and he would have to face the consequences. The legal process moved slowly, as these cases always do. There were pretrial hearings, motions, appeals, and delays. Wint's defense attorneys fought to suppress evidence, to challenge the DN findings, to argue that their client had not received a fair investigation. Prosecutors countered every challenge, confident in the strength of their evidence. The trial was scheduled, postponed, rescheduled. Years began to pass. The Savvopoulos daughters tried to rebuild their lives while waiting for justice. Vera Figueroa's family mourned their loss and waited for closure. The community watched and waited, hoping that the legal system would ultimately deliver a just verdict. Throughout this time, additional details about the crime continued to emerge through court filings and pretrial proceedings. The full horror of what the family had endured during those final hours became clearer. The extent of the injuries, the timeline of the violence, the cruel and methodical nature of the torture, all of it painted a picture of a crime that was almost incomprehensible in its brutality. One particularly haunting detail that emerged involved the family's dog. The Savvopoulos family had owned a dog that was found dead in a room of the mansion after the fire. The animal had apparently been kept in a separate area, perhaps barking or trying to defend the family. But it too had died in the fire, another innocent victim of Wint's rampage. This small detail resonated with many following the case. Even the family pet hadn't been spared. Wint had shown no mercy to anyone or anything in that house. His capacity for violence and his complete lack of empathy were on full display. As prosecutors prepared for trial, they assembled their witness list. Medical examiners would testify about the causes of death and the injuries the victims suffered. Forensic experts would explain the DNA evidence and the analysis of the fire. Employees from American Iron Works would describe the unusual text messages and the cash delivery. Family members of the victims would provide victim impact statements, telling the jury about the people who had been taken from them. The defense, meanwhile, was preparing to argue that while Wint might have been present at the mansion, the prosecution couldn't prove he was the actual killer. They would try to create reasonable doubt, to suggest that accomplices might have committed the actual murders while Wint played a lesser role. They would challenge the DNA evidence, the timeline, and the prosecution's theory of the case. But the evidence against Wint was overwhelming. The DNA placed him at the scene. His connection to the family established motive. The stolen money linked him to the crime. And the sheer brutality of the murders matched his history of violence, and his character as described by those who knew him. The question wasn't really whether Wint was guilty. The evidence made that clear. The question was whether he would be convicted, and if so, whether he would face the death penalty for his crimes. In Washington, D.C., capital punishment is not an option for crimes prosecuted by the district. But because this was such a high-profile case involving multiple murders, including the murder of a child, there had been discussions about whether federal prosecutors might take over the case, which would make the death penalty a possibility. Ultimately, the case remained with D.C. prosecutors, meaning that even if convicted, Wint would face life in prison rather than execution. Some members of the Savopoulos family and some members of the public felt this was too lenient for such heinous crimes. Others felt that life without parole was an appropriate punishment that didn't reduce society to Wint's level of violence. As the case moved toward trial, the community began to grapple with larger questions about safety, security, and the nature of evil. How had Wint been able to gain entry to such a secure home? What could homeowners do to protect themselves from similar attacks? And how could someone become so callous, so capable of such brutality, that they could torture and murder a child without apparent remorse? These questions had no easy answers. Security experts advised about alarm systems, safe rooms, and security protocols. Psychologists discussed the development of antisocial personality disorder and the warning signs of violent behavior. But in the end, the Savopoulos murders were a reminder that evil exists, that no amount of wealth or security can provide complete protection, and that sometimes terrible things happen to good people for no reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and in the case of Darren Dylon Wint, they turned with the careful deliberation required in capital murder prosecutions. After his arrest in May 2015, Wint sat in jail for years while the legal machinery ground forward through pretrial motions, evidence challenges, and procedural battles that would determine how the trial would ultimately proceed. During this time, prosecutors continued building their case, interviewing additional witnesses, conducting further forensic analysis, and preparing the massive amount of evidence that would need to be presented to a jury. The case file grew to thousands of pages. The physical evidence filled entire rooms. Every detail had to be documented, cataloged, and prepared for presentation in court. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, were doing everything possible to challenge the prosecution's case. They filed motions to suppress evidence, arguing that certain items had been collected improperly, or that the DNA analysis was flawed. They challenged the timeline that prosecutors had constructed, trying to create doubt about when certain events had occurred. They investigated the possibility of other suspects, trying to shift suspicion away from Wint. But with each challenge, the prosecution's case remained solid. The DNA evidence was unimpeachable. Modern forensic science had reached a level of precision that made it virtually impossible to dispute that Wint's DNA was on that pizza crust found at the crime scene. The timeline was supported by multiple sources of evidence: phone records, text messages, witness statements, and the physical evidence from the mansion itself. And the connection between Wint and the victims through his former employment at American Iron Works was a documented fact that couldn't be challenged. One of the major pretrial battles involved whether evidence of Wint's prior bad acts and criminal history could be introduced at trial. The defense argued that such evidence would be prejudicial, making the jury view Wint as a bad person rather than evaluating the specific evidence related to these murders. The prosecution countered that Wint's history of violence, his pattern of threatening behavior, and his previous employment at American Iron Works were all relevant to establishing motive and showing his capacity for the crimes he was accused of committing. The judge's rulings on these evidentiary questions would shape how the trial proceeded. Each ruling was carefully considered, with written opinions explaining the legal reasoning. Both sides understood that any error at this stage could result in appeals that might overturn a conviction or necessitate a new trial. As the trial date approached, jury selection became the next major hurdle. Finding 12 impartial jurors for such a high-profile case was extraordinarily difficult. The murders had been front-page news in Washington, D.C., for weeks after they occurred. Wint's photograph had been broadcast repeatedly on local news. Nearly everyone in the D.C. area had heard about the case and had formed at least preliminary opinions about it. The jury selection process, known as voir dire, took weeks. Hundreds of potential jurors were questioned about their knowledge of the case, their ability to be impartial, their views on circumstantial evidence, their feelings about violent crime, and their capacity to view graphic photographs and hear disturbing testimony without becoming too emotionally affected to render a fair verdict. Many potential jurors were dismissed because they had already formed strong opinions about Wint's guilt. Others were excused because they couldn't handle the emotional toll of hearing testimony about the torture and murder of a 10-year-old child. Still others were dismissed because of hardships that would make serving on a potentially months-long trial impossible. Eventually, 12 jurors and several alternates were seated. These individuals came from diverse backgrounds and represented a cross-section of the Washington, D.C. community. They would be sequestered during deliberations and would be responsible for determining Wint's fate based solely on the evidence presented in the courtroom. The trial of Darren Dylon Wint finally began in September 2018, more than 3 years after the murders. The delay was not unusual for a case of this magnitude, but for the victims' families, every day of waiting was another day without closure, another day of reliving the horror of what had been done to their loved ones. The courthouse was packed for opening statements. Members of the Savopoulos family sat in the front row of the gallery, wanting to bear witness to the proceedings against the man who had destroyed their family. Media representatives filled other seats, ready to report every detail of the trial to a public that had followed the case since the beginning. And Darren Wint sat at the defense table, now dressed in civilian clothes rather than a jail jumpsuit, flanked by his attorneys. The prosecution's opening statement laid out their theory of the case in methodical detail. The assistant U.S. attorney explained to the jury how Darren Wint, motivated by greed and resentment, had targeted the Savopoulos family because of his knowledge of Savas's wealth gained through his brief employment at American Iron Works. They described how Wint had invaded the family's home, held them captive for nearly 20 hours, tortured them to ensure compliance, extorted $40,000 from Savas's business, and then murdered all 4 victims before setting fire to the mansion to cover his tracks. The prosecutor walked the jury through the evidence they would see: the DNA on the pizza crust that definitively placed Wint at the scene, the text messages sent under duress requesting the cash delivery, the testimony of employees who had received those messages and delivered the money, the forensic evidence from the crime scene, the autopsy results showing the brutal nature of the murders, and the stolen cash found in Wint's possession when he was arrested. The evidence in this case will show you that Darren Wint is responsible for one of the most brutal crimes in this city's history, the prosecutor told the jury. He invaded a family's home, their sanctuary, and he turned it into a house of horrors. He tortured them, he terrorized them, he murdered them in cold blood, including a 10-year-old child. And then he tried to burn away the evidence of what he had done. But he failed. The evidence survived. and that evidence will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that this defendant is guilty of these murders. The defense's opening statement took a different approach. Wint's attorney didn't deny that their client had been at the mansion or that terrible crimes had been committed there. Instead, they tried to create doubt about who had actually committed the murders and what Wint's role had truly been. The defense attorney suggested that while Wint had been present at the house, perhaps in a minor role or even as an unwilling participant, the prosecution couldn't prove that he was the actual killer. They pointed to evidence that suggested multiple people had been involved in the crime, arguing that the real killers might have been accomplices who had never been identified or charged. The prosecution wants you to believe that Darren Wint committed these terrible murders alone, the defense attorney said. But the evidence will show that multiple people were involved in this crime. The prosecution hasn't identified all of those people. They haven't charged them. And they can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Darren Wint was the one who actually killed these victims. Being present at a crime scene doesn't make you a murderer. You have to prove it. And when you look carefully at all the evidence, you'll see that the prosecution hasn't met that burden. It was a difficult argument to make given the overwhelming evidence against Wint, but it was perhaps the only defense strategy available. The DNA evidence was too strong to challenge directly. The connection to the victims was too clear. All the defense could do was try to create enough doubt about the specifics of Wint's actions to prevent a conviction on the most serious charges. With opening statements complete, the prosecution began presenting its case. They started with the victims themselves, calling witnesses who could tell the jury about who Savas, Amy, Philip, and Vera had been as people. This served two purposes. It humanized the victims, making them more than just names in an indictment, and it established the baseline of their lives before the murders, showing that they had no connection to criminal activity or dangerous situations that might explain what happened to them. Coworkers of Savas testified about his character, describing him as a fair employer, a devoted family man, and a successful businessman who had built American Iron Works through hard work and integrity. They spoke about how he treated his employees with respect, how he remembered personal details about their lives, how he was the kind of boss people were happy to work for. Friends of Amy described her warmth, her generosity, her involvement in her children's lives and in the community. They painted a picture of a woman who made everyone around her feel valued and loved, who gave her time and energy to help others, who lived her life with grace and kindness. Teachers and classmates of Philip spoke about the bright, energetic boy who loved sports and had dreams of playing professional soccer someday. They described his kindness to other students, his enthusiasm for learning, his close relationship with his parents and sisters. The courtroom fell silent as these witnesses testified, many of them crying as they remembered the boy whose life had been so brutally cut short. Vera Figueroa's family members testified about the hardworking woman who had come to America seeking a better life and who had found it through honest work and dedication. They spoke of her devotion to her own family, her pride in her work, and the trust the Savopoulos family had placed in her. Vera had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, killed simply because she was a witness to Wint's crimes. These testimonies were emotional and powerful. Several jurors were seen wiping away tears as they heard about the victims' lives and the people they had been. This was exactly what the prosecution wanted. They needed the jury to see these victims as real people, not just abstract names, so that the full weight of what Wint had done would be felt. After establishing who the victims were, the prosecution moved to the events of May 13-14, 2015. They called the employees from American Iron Works who had the strange text messages from Seth requesting the 40,000 cash delivery. One employee testified about receiving the messages late on Wednesday evening, May 13th. He described how unusual the request had been. Savas had never asked for such a large cash delivery to his home before. The timing had been odd, coming late in the evening, rather than during normal business hours. And there had been something about the tone and wording of the messages that hadn't quite sounded like Savas's normal communication style. Couldn't put my finger on what was wrong, the employee testified. But something felt off. I almost called Mr. Sopoulos to confirm, but the messages were coming from his phone, so I assumed everything was legitimate. I just thought maybe he had some urgent business matter that required cash. The employee who had actually delivered the money to the mansion testified in detail about that Thursday morning transaction. He described arriving at the house, being met at the door by someone he didn't recognize, not Savas himself, and quickly handing over the package containing $40,000. The exchange had taken just moments, and then he had left, not realizing that he was delivering extortion money to murderers holding the family hostage inside. I should have insisted on Mr. Savopoulos personally, the employee said, his voice breaking with emotion. If I had just asked to come inside, if I had demanded to see him, maybe I could have saved them. That thought will haunt me for the rest of my life. The prosecution then brought in the forensic evidence, the physical proof of what had happened inside that mansion. Crime scene investigators testified about what they had found when they entered the burned house after the fire was extinguished. They described the condition of the bodies, the evidence of restraints that had been used on the victims, the weapons that had been found at the scene, including the baseball bat used to beat Savas. They explained the fire patterns that showed the blaze had been intentionally set using an accelerant, most likely gasoline. Photographs of the crime scene were shown to the jury, carefully selected images that documented the evidence without being gratuitously graphic. Even so, these photos were difficult to view. Jurors saw the burned interior of the mansion, the locations where the bodies had been found, the weapons used in the attacks. Several jurors looked uncomfortable or distressed as these images were displayed, but they understood this was necessary to understand the full scope of the crime. The arson investigator testified about how the fire had been set and what that revealed about the perpetrator's intentions. The use of gasoline as an accelerant showed premeditation. Someone had planned in advance to burn the house down. The multiple points of origin for the fire indicated that gasoline had been splashed throughout the mansion to ensure maximum destruction. This wasn't an accidental fire or even a spontaneous attempt to cover up a crime. It was a carefully planned arson designed to destroy as much evidence as possible. Then came the forensic evidence that would prove central to the case: the DNA found on the pizza crust. A forensic DNA expert took the stand and explained in detail how DNA analysis works, how samples are collected and tested, and how the results are interpreted. The expert testified that DNA recovered from a pizza crust found at the crime scene had been analyzed and compared against known samples in the criminal justice database. The match was to Darren Dylon Wint. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Wint was astronomically small, 1 in several quintillion. For all practical purposes, it was impossible that anyone other than Wint had left that DNA on the pizza crust. This DNA definitively places the defendant at the crime scene during the time the victims were being held captive, the expert testified. There is no reasonable scientific doubt about this conclusion. The defense cross-examined the expert vigorously, trying to find any weakness in the analysis or any possibility of contamination or error. But the expert's testimony held firm. The DNA testing had been conducted properly, following all established protocols. The chain of custody for the evidence had been maintained. The results were reliable and conclusive. The prosecution also presented evidence about Wint's former employment at American Iron Works. His personnel file showed that he had worked there briefly in 2013, giving him knowledge of Savas Savopoulos and the company's operations. The file also documented his termination for threatening other employees and poor performance. Former coworkers who had worked with Wint at American Iron Works testified about his behavior during his brief employment. They described him as volatile, prone to angry outbursts, resentful of authority, and quick to make threats when things didn't go his way. Several witnesses testified that Wint had seemed to resent Savas Savopoulos, making comments about the boss's wealth and privilege. He would say things like, "It must be nice to have all that money," or "Some people get everything handed to them," one former coworker testified. He was clear he was bitter about Mr. Savopoulos' success. After he was fired, He made some comments about getting even or about how Mr. Savopoulos would regret it, but we didn't take it seriously at the time. We thought it was just talk. This testimony established motive. Wint hadn't randomly selected the Savopoulos family as victims. He had targeted them specifically because he knew Savas was wealthy, because he had access to information about the family through his former employment, and because he harbored resentment about being fired, and about Savas's success compared to his own failures. The medical examiner who had performed the autopsies on all 4 victims provided some of the most difficult testimony of the trial. In clinical, professional language, the doctor described the injuries each victim had suffered and the causes of death. Savas Savopoulos had died from multiple stab wounds to the torso, but only after enduring a severe beating that had fractured his skull and broken multiple bones. The extent of the injury suggested prolonged torture, not just a quick killing. Savas had suffered tremendously before death. Amy Savopoulos had also been stabbed to death. She had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, showing that she had tried to protect herself from the knife attacks. The number and placement of the wounds suggested a frenzied, violent attack that went far beyond what would have been necessary to cause death. Philip Savopoulos, the 10-year-old boy, had been stabbed multiple times. The medical examiner's voice remained professional as she described these injuries, but the courtroom atmosphere was heavy with grief and horror. Several family members left the courtroom during this testimony, unable to bear hearing the details of how Philip had died. Vera Figueroa had also been stabbed to death, with injuries similar to those suffered by Amy. The medical examiner confirmed that all 4 victims had died before the fire was set. They had not died from smoke inhalation or burns, but from the violence inflicted on them by their killers. All of the victims would have been conscious during at least part of the attacks. The medical examiner testified. Based on the nature and placement of the wounds, they would have experienced significant pain and fear before death occurred. None of them would have died instantly or painlessly. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobbing of family members as this testimony was delivered. Jurors sat frozen, faces pale, as they absorbed the full horror of what had been done to the victims. This was not a quick, clean crime. The Savopoulos family and Vera Figueroa had suffered terribly in their final hours. The prosecution also presented evidence about Wint's movements after the murders. Cell phone records and surveillance footage tracked his path through Maryland in the days following the fire. Witnesses testified about seeing Wint with large amounts of cash in the days after the murders, spending freely and acting like someone who had suddenly come into money. A gas station attendant testified about seeing someone matching Wint's description purchasing multiple containers of gasoline on the day of the murders. The timing and location of this purchase matched perfectly with when and where the gasoline for the arson would have been obtained. When Wint was arrested, police had found approximately $10,000 in cash in the vehicles he was traveling in. Prosecutors argued this was what remained of the $40,000 stolen from the Savopoulos family. Wint had already spent much of it in the week he had been on the run, buying food, hotels, and other items in cash to avoid leaving a trail that could be traced through credit cards or bank transactions. The prosecution called nearly 50 witnesses over the course of several weeks. Each piece of evidence built on the previous one, creating a comprehensive picture of what had happened and who was responsible. By the time the prosecution rested its case, they had presented overwhelming evidence that Darren Wint had invaded the Savopoulos home, held the family and Vera Figueroa hostage, extorted $40,000 from Savas's business, murdered all 4 victims, and set fire to the mansion to cover his tracks. Now it was the defense's turn to present their case, to try to create reasonable doubt about Wint's guilt, to offer an alternative explanation for the evidence that had been presented. The defense called far fewer witnesses than the prosecution, and their strategy became clear. They were going to argue that while Wint had been at the mansion, he had not been the actual killer, and that accomplices who had never been identified or charged were the ones truly responsible for the murders. Defense witnesses testified about seeing other people around the mansion in the days before the murders, suggesting that a larger conspiracy had been at work. They called expert witnesses to challenge some of the prosecution's forensic conclusions, arguing that the physical evidence was consistent with multiple perpetrators and that it was impossible to determine which specific person had inflicted the fatal wounds. The defense also tried to establish that Wint's family members who had been arrested with him had played larger roles in the crime than prosecutors were willing to admit. They suggested that these individuals had helped plan and execute the murders, and that the prosecution was letting them off easy in order to focus solely on Wint. But the defense faced a fundamental problem. Wint himself did not testify. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and remained silent. This meant the jury never heard his version of events, never heard him explain what he was doing at the mansion or deny that he had committed the murders. The defense attorneys tried to frame this as Wint's constitutional right that shouldn't be held against him. But the reality was that his silence was damaging. If he truly had an innocent explanation for why his DNA was at the crime scene, why he had been in possession of the stolen money, why he had fled from police, the jury wanted to hear it. His refusal to testify suggested he had no good answers to those questions. During cross-examination of the defense witnesses, prosecutors systematically dismantled the alternative theories being offered. They showed that the alleged other people seen around the mansion were actually legitimate visitors or service workers who had no connection to the crime. They demonstrated that the defense's forensic experts were engaging in speculation rather than working from solid evidence. And crucially, prosecutors hammered home the point that even if accomplices had been involved, that didn't excuse or exonerate Wint. Under the law, anyone who participates in a felony that results in death can be charged with murder, regardless of who actually inflicted the fatal wounds. If Wint had been part of the home invasion and kidnapping, he was legally responsible for the murders that resulted, even if someone else had wielded the knife. The defense's case lasted only a few days compared to the weeks of prosecution testimony. When they rested, it was clear they had failed to create significant doubt about Wint's guilt. The evidence against him was simply too strong, too comprehensive, too damning. Closing arguments gave both sides one final chance to summarize their cases and persuade the jury. The prosecution's closing argument was powerful and emotional. The attorney walked the jury through the evidence one more time, showing how each piece fit together to prove Wint's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. They displayed photos of the victims when they were alive, Savas and Amy smiling together, Philip in his soccer uniform, Vera with her family, reminding the jury of the real people who had been taken. The prosecutor's voice filled the courtroom as he addressed the jury for the final time before deliberations. He stood before them, not with theatrical gestures or dramatic flair, but with the quiet authority of someone presenting incontrovertible truth. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over these past weeks you have heard testimony and seen evidence that proves, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Daron Dylan Wint is guilty of murdering 4 innocent people in one of the most brutal crimes this city has ever witnessed. He moved to a display board showing photographs of the victims, not crime scene photos but images of them alive, happy, full of the life that had been stolen from them. Savas Savopoulos was 46 years old. He had built a successful business through hard work and integrity. He employed people, including the defendant, and treated them with respect. He was a devoted husband and father who loved his family more than anything in the world. And in his final hours, he was beaten, tortured, and stabbed to death while his wife and son watched helplessly. The prosecutor paused, letting that image sink in before continuing. Amy Savopoulos was 47 years old. She was a mother who devoted her life to her children, a woman known for her kindness and generosity. She tried to fight off her attacker. We know this from the defensive wounds on her hands and arms. She fought to survive, fought to protect her son, and she died violently in her own home, the sanctuary she had created for her family. Another pause. Several jurors were visibly emotional now, some dabbing at their eyes with tissues. Philip Savopoulos was 10 years old. He loved soccer. He had dreams of playing professionally someday. He was a good student, a kind, loved son and brother. He watched his parents being tortured and murdered. And then, when he was alone and terrified and begging for his life, the defendant stabbed him to death. A 10-year-old child, think about that. A child who had done absolutely nothing wrong, who had his entire life ahead of him, murdered in cold blood for money. The prosecutor's voice broke slightly with emotion before he regained his composure. And Vera Figueroa, 57 years old, a hardworking housekeeper who had immigrated to this country seeking a better life. She had found that life through honest work and dedication. The Savopoulos family trusted her completely. And she died because she had the misfortune of being at work that day, of being a witness to the defendant's crimes. She was murdered simply because she was there. The prosecutor then turned to the evidence, methodically reviewing each piece that had been presented during the trial. The defendant's DNA was found on a pizza crust at the crime scene. Not DNA that might possibly be his DNA. The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than Darren Wint is 1 in several quintillion. That's a number so large it's almost incomprehensible. For all practical purposes, it is impossible that anyone other than the defendant left that DNA at the crime scene. He moved to the timeline. Using a chart that showed the sequence of events, the defendant knew the victims. He had worked for American Iron Works in 2013. He knew Savopoulos was wealthy. He knew about the business and how it operated. And after he was fired, he harbored resentment. Coworkers testified that he made comments about Mr. Savopoulos' wealth, that he seemed bitter about being terminated. This wasn't a random home invasion. The defendant specifically targeted this family because he knew them and knew they had money. The prosecutor walked the jury through the captivity, the extortion, the brutal murders, and the arson that followed. The defendant held this family hostage for nearly 20 hours. He forced Mr. Savopoulos to send text messages to his employees, arranging for $40,000 in cash to be delivered to the house. Those employees testified that the messages seemed odd, that something felt wrong. But they had no way of knowing their boss was being held at gunpoint, that his family was being tortured in their own home. He pointed to the evidence of the cash delivery, the employee testimony, and the money found in Wint's possession when he was arrested. The money was delivered Thursday morning, shortly after all 4 victims were murdered. The defendant got what he came for, and then he eliminated the witnesses. He beat Savopoulos so severely that his skull was fractured in multiple places. He stabbed him to death. He stabbed Amy to death while she fought desperately to defend herself. He stabbed Vera to death. And then, and this is almost too horrific to comprehend, he stabbed a 10-year-old child to death. The prosecutor's voice grew harder, more intense, and then, to cover his tracks, the defendant poured gasoline throughout the mansion and set it on fire. He tried to burn away the evidence. He tried to destroy the bodies so investigators couldn't determine how the victims had died. He tried to eliminate any trace of his presence in that house. But he failed. Because despite his attempts to cover his tracks, the evidence survived. And that evidence proves his guilt. He addressed the defense's theory that accomplices might have committed the actual murders. The defense wants you to believe that while the defendant was present at the house, someone else committed these murders. But even if that were true, and there is no evidence that it is, it doesn't matter under the law. If you participate in a home invasion, if you participate in a kidnapping, if you participate in an armed robbery, and someone dies as a result, you are guilty of murder. Every participant is equally guilty. The defendant's DNA was at the scene. The defendant had the stolen money when he was arrested. The defendant fled from police and was captured trying to escape. He is guilty of these murders, whether he wielded the knife himself, or whether he held the victims down while someone else stabbed them. The prosecutor's closing was devastating in its logical precision and emotional impact. He had taken the jury step by step through the evidence, showing how each piece connected to every other piece, building an unassailable case that Darren Wint was responsible for these brutal murders. 4 people are dead. A family was destroyed. A hardworking woman was murdered. And the person responsible sits in this courtroom. Don't let him escape justice. Don't let him hide behind technicalities or speculation about unidentified accomplices. Look at the evidence. Consider the testimony. and return the only verdict that the facts support guilty on all counts. The defense's closing argument faced the unenviable task of trying to create doubt where virtually none existed. Wint's attorney stood before the jury, knowing that the evidence against his client was overwhelming, but obligated to mount the strongest defense possible. Ladies and gentlemen, no one is disputing that terrible crimes were committed in that mansion. No one is disputing that 4 people were murdered in a brutal, senseless attack. And no one is disputing that whoever did this deserves to be punished to the fullest extent of the law. The attorney paused, making eye contact with several jurors. But the question you must answer is not whether crimes were committed. The question is whether the prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Darren Wint is the person who committed those crimes. And when you look carefully at the evidence, you'll see that reasonable doubt exists. The defense attorney tried to focus on the evidence of multiple perpetrators, arguing that the prosecution had failed to identify all the people involved in the crime. The evidence shows that multiple people were involved in this home invasion. The prosecution's own witnesses testified to this. Controlling 4 hostages for nearly 20 hours would be extremely difficult for one person. The physical evidence shows multiple people moving through that house. Yet the prosecution has only charged one person with these murders. Where are the others? Who were they? What roles did they play? He tried to suggest that these unidentified accomplices might have been the actual killers. Finding Mr. Wint's DNA on a pizza crust proves he was in the house. We're not disputing that. But being present at a crime scene doesn't make you a murderer. The prosecution wants you to assume that because he was there, he must have committed the murders. But that's not proof. That's speculation. They can't prove who wielded the knife that killed these victims. They can't prove that Mr. Wint was the one who inflicted the fatal wounds. It was a weak argument, and the defense attorney seemed to know it. His tone lacked conviction, and several jurors appeared skeptical of what he was saying. He tried another approach, questioning why the prosecution hadn't charged anyone else involved in the crime. The prosecution has evidence that other people helped Mr. Wint. They arrested several people with him. They know others were involved. Yet they've chosen to charge only Mr. Wint with these murders. Why? Could it be because they're not certain who actually killed these victims? Could it be because the evidence doesn't clearly establish which person did what? But this argument had a fundamental flaw that the prosecution had already addressed under the law. Everyone who participates in a felony that results in death is guilty of murder. Even if the defense could create doubt about whether Wint had personally stabbed the victims, and they couldn't, he would still be guilty if he had participated in the home invasion and kidnapping. The defense attorney tried to find holes in the timeline, questioning whether investigators had truly established when certain events occurred. He challenged some of the forensic conclusions, suggesting that the evidence was open to interpretation. He emphasized that Wint had not confessed to the crimes, and that much of the prosecution's case relied on circumstantial evidence. But every argument rang hollow against the weight of the evidence. The DNA was conclusive. The connection between Wint and the victims was clear. The stolen money had been found in his possession. He had fled from police, and most damningly, he had refused to testify or offer any alternative explanation for the evidence against him. The defense's closing argument lasted less than half as long as the prosecution's. When the attorney finally sat down, it was clear that he had not succeeded in creating meaningful doubt about his client's guilt. The evidence was simply too strong, the case too overwhelming. The judge then instructed the jury on the law they must apply in their deliberations. These instructions covered the elements of each charge, the definition of reasonable doubt, how to evaluate evidence and witness testimony, and the standards they must use in reaching their verdict. The jury was charged with deciding Wint's guilt or innocence on multiple counts. 4 counts of first-degree murder, felony murder charges, kidnapping, burglary, extortion, and arson. Each charge had specific elements that the prosecution needed to prove, and the jury would have to consider each charge separately. The judge explained that first-degree murder requires proof of premeditation and deliberation, that the killing was planned and intentional, not spontaneous or accidental. For felony murder, the jury needed to find that the deaths occurred during the commission of another felony, such as kidnapping or burglary, regardless of whether the killing was intentional. After receiving their instructions, the jury was escorted to the deliberation room to begin their discussions. It was now late afternoon, and the judge indicated that if they didn't reach a verdict by a certain hour, they would be sent home for the evening and would resume deliberations the following day. The Savvopoulos family members who had attended the trial left the courtroom to wait in a private room. This was the hardest part, waiting for the jury to decide the fate of the man who had destroyed their family. Every minute felt like an hour. Every hour felt like an eternity. In the deliberation room, the 12 jurors began the solemn task of reviewing the evidence and discussing the case. They elected a foreman to guide their discussions, and started by taking an initial poll to see where everyone stood. The first vote was nearly unanimous for conviction on all charges. Only one juror expressed any hesitation. And that hesitation wasn't about Wint's guilt but about whether the prosecution had proven the first-degree murder charges as opposed to the lesser, included offense of second-degree murder. The jurors spent hours reviewing the evidence, discussing the testimony, and working through their uncertainties. They looked again at the photographs from the crime scene, reread portions of the medical examiner's testimony, and discussed the DNA evidence in detail. The juror who had expressed hesitation about the first-degree murder charges focused on the element of premeditation. Had Wint planned these murders in advance? Or had they occurred spontaneously during the commission of the kidnapping and robbery? The distinction mattered legally, and this juror wanted to be certain they were reaching the correct verdict. Other jurors pointed to the evidence of planning. Wint had brought weapons to the house. He had arranged for the cash delivery, knowing he would need to keep the family alive long enough for the money to arrive. He had obtained gasoline for the arson, showing he had planned to destroy the crime scene, and the extended torture of the victim suggested calculated cruelty, not spontaneous violence. The discussion was thorough and serious. These 12 people understood the gravity of their responsibility. They were about to decide whether a man would spend the rest of his life in prison. They wanted to be absolutely certain they were making the right decision based on the evidence and the law. As evening approached on the first day of deliberations, the jury sent a note to the judge indicating they wanted to continue working rather than going home for the night. They felt they were close to reaching a verdict and wanted to complete their task. The judge agreed, and the deliberations continued into the evening. In the courthouse hallways and in the private rooms where family members waited, tension was palpable. Everyone knew that a verdict could come at any moment. Finally, at approximately 8:30 p.m., the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The judge recalled all the attorneys, the defendant, and the family members to the courtroom. Media representatives rushed to get seats, knowing they were about to witness the conclusion of one of the most significant murder trials in Washington, D.C. history. The courtroom filled quickly. The Savvopoulos family's 3 surviving daughters sat together in the front row, holding hands, their faces showing the strain of years of waiting for this moment. Vera Figueroa's family members sat nearby, equally anxious to hear the verdict. Darren Wint was brought into the courtroom and took his seat at the defense table. His face showed no emotion. He stared straight ahead, seemingly detached from the proceedings that would determine his fate. The judge entered, and everyone stood. After taking the bench, the judge asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreman stood and confirmed that they had. The verdict forms were handed to the judge, who reviewed them to ensure they were properly completed. Then the forms were handed to the court clerk, who would read them aloud. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Every person present held their breath, waiting for the words that would finally bring justice or deny it. The clerk began reading. In the case of the United States versus Darren Dylan Wint, on the charge of first-degree murder while armed in the death of Sava Savvopoulos, we the jury find the defendant guilty. A gasp went through the courtroom. One of the Savvopoulos daughters began crying quietly, 'On the charge of first-degree murder while armed in the death of Amy Savvopoulos, We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. On the charge of first-degree murder while armed in the death of Philip Savvopoulos, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The daughter, who had been crying quietly, now sobbed openly, burying her face in her sister's shoulder. On the charge of first-degree murder while armed in the death of Veralicia Figueroa, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The clerk continued through all the charges: guilty of felony murder, guilty of kidnapping, guilty of burglary, guilty of extortion, guilty of arson. On every single count, the verdict was the same: guilty. Wint showed no reaction as the verdicts were read. He sat motionless, his face blank, as if the words had nothing to do with him. His attorney sat beside him, having expected this outcome but still processing the finality of it. When the clerk finished reading the verdicts, the judge polled the jury individually, asking each juror to confirm that these were their verdicts. One by one, all 12 jurors affirmed their decision. Darren Dylon Wint was guilty of murdering 4 people in one of the most brutal crimes in Washington, D.C. history. The judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Sentencing would be scheduled for a later date, giving the prosecution and defense time to prepare their arguments about what punishment Wint should receive. As Wint was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, members of the Savvopoulos family embraced each other, crying with relief and grief. They had waited more than 3 years for this moment. The verdict didn't bring back their loved ones, didn't undo the horror of what had happened, but it was a form of justice, an acknowledgement that what had been done to their family was wrong, and that the person responsible would be held accountable. Outside the courthouse, the prosecution team held a brief press conference. They expressed satisfaction with the verdict and thanked the jury for their careful consideration of the evidence. Today, justice was served for Savas, Amy, Philip, and Vera, the lead prosecutor said. While nothing can bring them back or undo the pain their families have suffered, this verdict ensures that the person responsible for these horrific crimes will be held accountable. Darren Wint will spend the rest of his life in prison, and he will never again be able to harm anyone. The Savvopoulos family also released a statement through their attorney, thanking law enforcement, the prosecutors, and the jury for their work on the case. Our family has been forever changed by the loss of Savas, Amy, and Philip. The statement read, "No verdict can bring them back to us or fill the void they left behind. But we are grateful that justice has been done, that the person who took them from us has been found guilty, and that he will never walk free again. We can now begin the process of healing, knowing that our loved ones did not die in vain, and that their killer will face the consequences of his actions." The sentencing phase of the trial took place several weeks later. This was the opportunity for the victims' families to address the court, and for the judge to determine what sentence Wint would receive. In Washington, D.C., the death penalty is not an option for crimes prosecuted by the district. This meant that regardless of how brutal the murders had been, Wint would not face execution. Instead, the maximum sentence he could receive was life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements, testimony from family members about how the murders had affected their lives. These statements are not evidence in the legal sense, but they give the court insight into the human cost of the crimes and help the judge determine an appropriate sentence. The 3 surviving Savvopoulos daughters each took the stand to speak about their parents and brother. Their words were heartbreaking, painting a picture of a close-knit, loving family that had been torn apart by senseless violence. The oldest daughter spoke about her father, describing him as a hero, her role model, the man who had taught her the value of hard work and integrity. "My father built his business from nothing," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "He came to this country as an immigrant and achieved the American dream through determination and honesty. He treated everyone with respect, regardless of their position or status. He was generous, kind, and devoted to his family, and he was taken from us in the most brutal way imaginable. I will never understand how anyone could do what was done to him." Another daughter spoke about her mother, describing Amy's warmth, her creativity, her ability to make everyone feel loved and valued. "My mother was the heart of our family," she testified through tears. She made our house a home. She was there for every school event, every celebration, every difficult moment. She gave her time and energy to help others, always putting everyone else's needs before her own. She deserved to grow old, to see her children marry, to meet her grandchildren. Instead, she was murdered in her own home, the place where she had created so much love and happiness for all of us. The youngest daughter, who was old enough to testify, spoke about her brother Philip, the baby of the family, the boy everyone had adored. Philip was only 10 years old, she said, sobbing openly now. He was just a little boy. He loved soccer and martial arts. He wanted to be a professional athlete someday. He had his whole life ahead of him. And he was murdered, a child. How do you do that? How do you look at a 10-year-old child and decide to take his life? Philip was innocent. He had done nothing wrong. And he died terrified and in pain, watching his parents being killed. I think about his last moments every day, and it breaks my heart over and over again. Vera Figueroa's family members also testified, speaking about the hardworking, devoted woman who had been killed simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her daughter described her mother's journey from El Salvador to the United States, her dedication to providing for her family, and the pride she took in her work. My mother worked so hard to give us a better life, the daughter testified. She cleaned houses, she took care of other people's families, and she did it all with dignity and pride. The Savopoulos family trusted her and treated her well. She had no reason to fear going to work that day. But she walked into a nightmare, and she never came home. She was 67 years old and looking forward to retirement, to spending time with her grandchildren. Instead, she was murdered by someone who saw her as nothing more than a witness to be eliminated. After hearing the victim impact statements, the judge addressed the courtroom. The weight of the case, the brutality of the crimes, and the suffering of the families hung heavy in the air. Mr. Wint, the judge began, looking directly at the defendant. You have been found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping, burglary, extortion, and arson. The jury heard the evidence and concluded correctly that you are responsible for one of the most heinous crimes this city has ever witnessed. The judge paused, letting the words settle. You invaded a family's home, their sanctuary, and turned it into a house of horrors. You held them captive for nearly 20 hours, torturing them, terrorizing them. You murdered Savas Savopoulos, a hardworking man who had employed you and treated you with respect. You murdered Amy Savopoulos, a devoted mother and wife. You murdered Vera Figueroa, a hardworking woman who had done nothing wrong. And you murdered Philip Savopoulos, a 10-year-old child who had his entire life ahead of him. The judge's voice grew harder. You showed no mercy. You showed no remorse. And even now, sitting in this courtroom, you have shown no recognition of the enormity of what you have done. You took 4 innocent lives for money that you spent frivolously in the days after the murders, as if their deaths meant nothing. The sentence was pronounced with finality: 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for the other charges. Darren Dylon Wint would spend the rest of his life in prison. He would never breathe free air again. He would never harm another person. He would die behind bars, alone and forgotten. Wint was led from the courtroom for the last time. He never looked at the victims' families, never offered an apology, never showed any sign that he understood or cared about the devastation he had caused. In the years that followed, the Savopoulos daughters worked to rebuild their lives while honoring the memory of their parents and brother. They established scholarships in Philip's name, supporting young athletes pursuing their dreams. They donated to causes their parents had cared about, keeping alive the legacy of generosity and community service that Savas and Amy had exemplified. The mansion on Woodland Drive was eventually demolished, the property sold. A new home now stands where that horror unfolded, and the neighborhood has slowly healed. Though the memory of what happened there will never be completely erased. The case remains a stark reminder that evil exists, that tragedy can strike without warning, and that no amount of wealth or security can provide absolute protection. But it also stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement, the power of forensic science, and the commitment of the justice system to hold even the most brutal killers accountable for their crimes. And now, as we close this chapter, we remember Sav as Amy, Philip, and Vera, not as victims, but as people who lived, loved, and deserved so much more than the fate that befell them. Thank you for listening. If you found this case meaningful, please leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.